welcome, welcome, welcome. I don't know about you, but I'm excited about what's happening today. I'm excited about what happened decades ago during the time Dr. King lived. I am not sad about his death because he did so much during the time he lived. And it's something to celebrate. And I'm excited that every seat has been taken and that some of us are willing to stand as we commemorate this incredible human being who came, walked on the earth with us, and left us a legacy of which we can all claim as part of our America, our legacy. So let's give a yoo-hoo! I'm Dr. Ruth Wilson, and Chair of African American Studies, and I was so excited when Dr. Sherratt came to our department and wanted to collaborate on putting together this outstanding program. And I want you to give him a big hand as he comes and talks about the Legacy Committee.
Well, thank you, Ruth, and thank you all for coming. This is a very challenging time, and so we have to really face that challenge with the ideas and the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. So I just wanted to mention a little bit about the chief organizer of this event, which is the Dr. Martin Luther King Legacy Committee. And it really has been around ever since this library moved to this location. And I want to give credit to Dr. Oscar Battle, who was the founder of this committee many years ago.
Let's give him a hand clap.
Yes. And the committee has been holding this event on Dr. King's birthday almost every year since then. We had a lapse of 3 years, but I'm so glad that we're bringing it back this year. The other thing I want to mention is, when we say reclaiming the legacy, what do we mean by that? And there's a mainstream narrative about Dr. King that he was a civil rights leader, he had a dream, and he was about nonviolence. And of course, that's only part of King. All of those are true, but he was much more than that, because he struggled. He struggled not only for civil rights, but against poverty, for socioeconomic equality, against militarism, and so many other things about social justice in this country, and for that matter, around the world. That's what he stood for. That's his true legacy, and we're going to find out, or we're going to be reminded about what his true legacy is when we hear the readings from 9 of his speeches that will tell what the real legacy is. Finally, I want to just, before we move on to the main program, I just want to acknowledge the supporters and the co-sponsors of this event. The Human Agenda, Our Developing World, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the NAACP of San Jose Silicon Valley, the San Jose State University African American Studies, the Center for Convivial Research and Autonomy, the Billy DeFrank LGBTQ Youth Community Center, Friday Peace Vigil, Jewish Voice for Peace of Silicon Valley, the Ambedkar King Study Circle, the Green Party of Santa Clara County, the San Jose Peace and Justice Center, Justice for Palestinians, and the Leonard Peltier Support Group of Silicon Valley. Now, I also want to thank the library, Dr. Martin Luther King Library, which bears Dr. King's name, which actually has 2 parts. It has a university part and a public San Jose Public Library part. And both of these parts have joined together to give support and allowing us to have this event here. So we just want to give a hand to the library.
Our next speaker is Sherratt, Sorry. Okay. Our next speaker is Emily Chan, the Associate Dean at the San Jose State Library, without whom we would not be here today.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, let me acknowledge and thank the wonderful drummers' performance and dance. That was truly a remarkable way to open up the program. As Dr. Wilson said, I'm Emily Chan, and I'm the current interim Associate Dean for Research and Scholarship here at the University Library. I'd like to welcome you all to the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Library, a joint academic and public library that serves the San Jose State University and City of San Jose communities. Together, today, we are gathered to commemorate what would have been Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s 89th birthday on Monday. Speakers today are going to share Dr. King's eloquent speeches and powerful writing to remind us all of the magnitude of his great mind, resolve, heart, and optimism. Given today's current political and social climate, it's all the more important to reflect on Dr. King's accomplishments and the manner in which he achieved them. Dr. King's lessons and commitment to equality, to justice, to humanity, and to social change should inspire us all. The library is truly honored to be the location of today's program. I invite you all to view the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. collection on the third floor, where you can view artwork and a special gallery of photos and newspaper clippings that form a timeline of his life. And how fitting that we hold this program here. This library welcomes all and promotes human freedom through the equal access of information. So, on behalf of the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Library, I thank you all for attending today's program. Welcome, enjoy, and reflect. Thank you for having me.
Now, as a test, because I'm a teacher, which floor did she say the exhibit is on? Third floor. Love it. Okay. All right. It's good to have a sense of humor here. Our next person on our schedule is Professor Scott Myers. Look who. Scott Myers-Lipton, who is a sociology professor here at San Jose State, and one of the 3 people responsible for me saying yes when I was interviewing for the job and the job was offered. The discussion with him and the fact, I think he had his family, children or something on the website. I said, woo, they are family friendly there. I think I want to be a part of that community of scholars. And so, would you like to come greet us?
Thank you for that introduction. So I teach a class here at San Jose State University on Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. During this class, we trace the events of Dr. King's life from the bus boycott of Montgomery to the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., where he spoke of his dream, to the slums in Chicago, where he lived for a short time, from Marks, Mississippi, which was where he was to start the Poor People's Campaign, to Memphis, Tennessee, where he went to support garbage workers, and sadly, tragically, where he was murdered. As you can imagine, Martin's journey and the thousands and thousands and thousands of other freedom fighters with him, this journey and struggle to build a just society is rich and full of incredible stories of bravery, courage, and sacrifice. And they easily fill up a 4-month class over 30 sessions. Unfortunately, we don't have 30 sessions to talk about why Dr. King's legacy is so critical for us today. I have 10 minutes, so I will keep it brief, but hopefully memorable. Let me start by saying that some intellectuals are Marxists, some are Weberian. As for me, I'm a Kingian. I'm a Kingian because I think Dr. King has the correct analysis for American society, the correct solutions, and the correct method to bring about change. First, let me explain King's analysis of American society. King's analysis of the United States was that racism, economic exploitation, poverty, and militarism were interrelated problems that undermined the beloved community. King called the three interrelated problems the giant triplets, or the triple evils. King would state that, quote, when machines and computers, profits and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, economic exploitation, and militarism are incapable of being conquered, end of quote. To see how King saw how economic exploitation and racism were interconnected, King argued that there was a curious formula which dated back to the writing of the U.S. Constitution, which defined a black person as 60% of a human being when determining taxation and representation. Martin would say that this curious formula still existed in his times, but it declared blacks 50% of a person. Since of the good things of life, blacks had approximately one-half those of whites. Of the bad things, blacks had twice those of whites. Now, today, some people say and claim that we live in a colorblind society or a post-racist society. But I am here today as a Kingian to say that the relationship between racism and economic exploitation still exists in these United States, as the curious formula still describes today's America. For example, in 1968, the year King was murdered, the unemployment rate was 5% for whites. Do the math, 2 times the rate, 10% for blacks. Today, white unemployment in the United States is 3.4%. Do the math, 2 times the level. Black unemployment, 7%. In 1968, 10% of whites lived in poverty, compared to 35% African Americans. Sometimes it's 2 times, sometimes it's 3 times, and sometimes more. Today, 8.8% of whites live in poverty, compared to 22.8% of African Americans. A bit less than 3 times. And right here in Santa Clara County, sometimes you don't have to go far, right here, the infant mortality rate, which is generally described as an accurate indicator of general health of a community, 2.9% for whites, do the math, 2 times, 7% for blacks. And the median household income in this area, $101,000 for whites, about a half, $60,000 for blacks. As I stated earlier, I am a Kingian because his analysis of U.S. problems and the tools that he gave us to analyze it are still accurate today. King's curious formula gives us an important conceptual tool to understand the interconnection between racism and economic exploitation. But King didn't stop here between those two. He also saw how those two were connected to militarism. For King, militarism was an ideology and a framework of action based on large military spending and a willingness to use the military to protect the economic interests of the elite. When speaking of militarism and its connection to racism and poverty, King would say, quote, a nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them. I think it's really important to think about that, what those words state in light of what our president just said. A nation that will keep people in slavery for 244 years will thingify them, make them things. Therefore, they will exploit them, and poor people generally, economically. And a nation that will exploit economically will have foreign investments and everything else, and will have to use its military to protect them. All of these problems are tied together. I believe 49 years later, this time, if we think back to 1968, and now come up to 2018, almost 50 years, I believe that King would look at today's military spending, which in 2018, this year, $824 billion for our military. And he would question why so much is spent on that when the U.S. government spends just $50 billion on low-income housing, $70 billion on food for low-income families, As he stated, a nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual doom. So to be a Kingian, we must embrace King's analysis of the problem, and at the heart of his analysis are the giant triplets and the curious formula. I hope you remember those two, as I'm a teacher too, right? Hope you remember those concepts, the giant triplets and the curious formula. But to be a Kingian also means to embrace King's solutions, because he had solutions to America's problems, which means we need to implement an economic Bill of Rights. Dr. King had concluded that American, some people don't like to hear this, American capitalism was flawed, he said, since it did not provide enough living wage jobs for its people. Yep. I'm saying he didn't say it has to be overthrown, he says it's flawed. And to correct that, he has a response. King called, and by the 67, 68, he called the historic 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voter Rights Act superficial changes, since they had done little to change the economic conditions of black Americans. King said that the movement needed to move from civil rights to human rights. In response, King proclaimed, quote, "Now our struggle is for genuine equality, which means economic equality. For we now know that it isn't enough to integrate lunch counters. What does it profit a man to be able to eat at the swankiest restaurants when he doesn't earn enough money to take his wife out to dine? What does it profit one to have access to the hotels of our cities and the hotels of our highways when we don't earn enough money to take our family on a vacation?" King felt that the best solution to solve the problems caused by racism and economic exploitation was an economic Bill of Rights. First put forward by Franklin Roosevelt in 1944, an economic Bill of Rights is composed of several fundamental rights. And importantly, the right to a job, the right to a living wage, and the right to housing. So important. We got 1 minute. I'm almost there. In his last book, Dr. King argued that we need a contemporary economic Bill of Rights to supplement the Constitution's political Bill of Rights. In an article published 8 days after his assassination, King stated, "We need an economic Bill of Rights. This would guarantee a job to all people who want to work and are able to work. It would also guarantee an income for all who are not able to work. In fact, those were the exact demands of the Poor People's Campaign. The creation of a massive public works program, a guaranteed income at middle income levels, and the creation of 5 million low-income homes. These were the goals of Dr. King when he was assassinated. Let me just say, because I know I got just a minute here, the curious formula still exists. In California, 23% of blacks live in poverty, 19% of Latinos compared to 10% whites. And so let me just say the last thing. We need to look at the method about change to bring about these goals. Of course, we all know King was dedicated to nonviolence, but more of us must become knowledgeable of how King focused his nonviolent actions on targets to create an environment that allowed for change to take place. On a personal note, this is what I've dedicated the past decade of my life to, understanding the change process, so as to take the policy ideas that San Jose State students have and to help the students implement them. So you probably know about the minimum wage campaign, which that's what student thought of and created the environment that allowed for the $8 to $10 and now to $15. But we've won 12 campaigns using this change process. The most recent, I just need to say, was when President Papazian. No, it's actually not right. Help me with that. Papazian, thank you. President Papazian just 2 days ago emailed the students and agreed to join the Workers' Rights Consortium, which will not allow our clothes to be sweatshopped in developing countries. It's an important victory, and these are the kind of things that our students are doing. So thank you so much. I would just say, in conclusion, let's be clear. We need to be clear on this day. The change that we're calling for and that Dr. King envisioned is not going to be a minor thing. It is going, and it's a clarion call, just like those drums called us. It's a clarion call coming from 50 years back, calling us to be engaged in a massive assault on poverty, racism, and militarism. and I encourage you all to be involved in this great Kingian work. Thank you very much.
We love sociology. He's a sociologist. We're going to backstep a little bit. Our Assemblywoman Cindy Chavez is here. Cindy, where are you? Can you come up and greet us, please?
So you're going to hear from much wiser people than me today. So although I'm now over 50, so I'm wise. I'm wise just by age. I wanted to say just two things. One, I wanted to thank everyone for being here today. And two, I just want to pick up on a theme that Scott talked about. And that is about how we take philosophy and make it something real in people's lives. I want to thank all of you because you played a leadership role in passing Measure A here, and that's our affordable housing bond. $950 million. Wouldn't have happened without you. But here's what's so important about that. At the time we were putting that on the ballot, Los Angeles was having a debate about how much they would put a housing bond on. When we came up with $1 million, they came up with more. We are part of a movement. We are part of change making through movements. And I want to ask all of you not to let any of us, not to let me, not to let Ash, not to let any elected official who tells you that they have a vision and that they're progressive to not put that in action. And the best of us, and I mean this about myself too, the best of us need you to help us to create this political space and will for transformative change. It is transformative to take, because I believe on our watch, we're going to remove homelessness in our community. We're going to do that together. I am 100% confident of that. But that transformative change came through philosophy, energy, investment, in policy that is change making. Now, all across the county, as we're trying to get these places built, our voices need to be heard because we've got to be at those meetings, we've got to be at those council meetings, we've got to be in those neighborhood meetings saying, yes, in our backyard. So, in honor of Dr. King today, I say, yes, in our backyard. Thank you.
Shrugged.
Yes. So before we go on, I just wanted to point out for those of you who are just coming in the room, there are programs for this event on the two chairs on either side, or especially this chair. So if you don't have a program, please feel free to come and pick one up. So now we have a special visitor that is Assemblyman Ash Clara. And Ash Clara is an amazing individual. He was on the San Jose City Council, and now he's in the Assembly, and he was nominated, as I understand it, to be the most progressive member of the California Assembly.
Thank you. Well, I just want to thank all of you for being here, for putting this together. Over a dozen organizations to come together. That's the unity we need in these times. Yesterday, I had the great honor of speaking on the floor of the State Assembly on behalf of the API Legislative Caucus in recognition of Dr. King's birthday. And it's quite an overwhelming experience to have the opportunity to do that. But as I had the opportunity to do that, not only did I speak to the importance of his legacy to the Asian Pacific Islander community and to all of us as Americans, but what that means today. And looking around this room, especially the organizations represented, you are the legacy of Dr. King. And we must remember that his legacy is through our actions today. And one of the things mentioned, I think our supervisor said it very well, it's about holding to account those that are in power. And so one of the things that I look forward to doing this year, in the anniversary of the Poor People's Campaign and the Economic Bill of Rights, as Dr. Lipton spoke to, is not only to commemorate it, but to actually hold to account legislators, the legislative priorities and bills that speak to that Economic Bill of Rights. And so In fact, I already started talking with a couple of our friends, Senator Lorena Gonzalez-Fletcher in San Diego, which I know is a good friend of Cindy's, as well as Senator Reggie Jones-Sawyer. The three of us were part of the group that helped to put together a progressive caucus of members. But now, once you put together a group, it's not just about getting together and having a cup of coffee. Now it's where the action takes place. And that's really where the legacy of Dr. King and reclaiming his legacy has us most influence and most power. We must continue to fight every single day more than ever, and I look forward to fighting with each and every one of you in the months and years ahead. So thank you all so much. And I brought a certificate to recognize today's event, and so I want to thank all of you. If you want to come up and I can give it to both of you. But I just want to thank you for organizing the event and for the great turnout. It's great to see so many people here.
Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to start with the first group of readings of Dr. King's speeches. Now each of these is at most 3 minutes, so it won't be too long. So our first reader is Barbie Ulmer, who is from Our Developing World.
What a privilege. Thank you so much. I'm reading from Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution. That was a speech he gave at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. on March 31st, 1968. And if you just substitute the Middle East, when he said Vietnam, it could have been written today. I want to say one other challenge that we face is simply that we must find an alternative to war and bloodshed. Anyone who feels, there are still a lot of people who feel that way, that war can solve the social problems facing mankind is sleeping through a great revolution. I hope we continue to make it. My editing. President Kennedy said on one occasion, mankind must put an end to war, or war will put an end to mankind. The world must hear this. I pray God that America will hear this before it's too late, because today we're fighting a war. I'm convinced that it is one of the most unjust wars that has ever been fought in the history of the world. Our involvement in war in Vietnam has torn up the Geneva Accord. It has strengthened the military-industrial complex. It has strengthened the forces of reaction in our nation. It has put us against the self-determination of a vast majority of Vietnamese people and put us in the position of protecting a corrupt regime that is stacked against the poor. It has played havoc with our domestic destinies. This day, we are spending $500,000 to kill each Viet Cong soldier. Every time we kill one, we spend about $500,000, while we spend only $53 a year for every person characterized as poverty-stricken in the so-called poverty program, which is not even a good skirmish against poverty. Not only that, it has put us in a position of appearing to the world as an arrogant nation. And here we are, 10,000 miles away from home, fighting for the so-called freedom of the Vietnamese people, when we have not even put our own house in order. And we force young black men and young white men to fight and kill in brutal solidarity, yet when they come back home, they can't hardly live on the same block together. It is no longer a choice, my friends, between violence and nonviolence. It is either nonviolence or non-existence.
Thank you. Next Dr. Ruth Wilson from the African American Studies.
I'm a renegade. I'm going to share with you something my father told me. My father was a garbage man, and he was very proud of being a garbage man because it was a steady job, and it meant he had work every day. And during the Christmas holidays, he worked on Christmas Eve, and the day after Christmas. And he was very proud of his work. And when he heard Martin Luther King address the garbage man on TV, he wept. He said, Rufy, come in here. So I ran in there. You see that man there? You see it? You see it? He's trying to help the garbage man. Do you understand what that means? No, Daddy, I don't understand. He's trying to help me, my family, so I can have a vacation, so I can have a pension. That was my daddy. Yes. All right. What's happening here? I can still hear his voice. My father has passed on, but I can hear his voice and the intensity with which he gave accolades to Dr. King's insight. And for him, for anybody to care about the garbage man, meant they had a revolution going on inside of their heads. Because can you imagine what we would do without someone getting all that garbage from our backyard, front yard, wherever we put the can, and removing it so that germs and filth would not inhabit our children, our play areas, and so forth? Can you imagine that? Dr. King was concerned about the garbage man. That's my 2 minutes.
Thank you, Ruth. Next, we have Wendy Greenfield from Jewish Voice for Peace.
I'm going to also ask your indulgence for a moment and allow me to say that I hold Dr. King personally responsible for me being here today. As a child growing up in suburban Long Island, I was a TV junkie to watch anything to do with the civil rights movement and Dr. King. And in elementary school, my sister and I decided to take on our neighborhood, which we suddenly realized was all white. Until he said something about that, it didn't click for us. And so we went door to door trying to get the neighbors to agree that the next family that moved into our neighborhood should be black. We were not successful. And in fact, we had a little impromptu meeting of neighbors on our front lawn that night, calling my father out. But it certainly opened my eyes, if nothing else. And at the ripe old age of 14, I was organizing for the Farm Workers Union, the boycott, and came out to California because of that. And so here I am. So thank you, Dr. King, and all of the many people who played a part in that movement. So I am very happy also, because of the Farm Workers Connection, that I have a passage to read that is related to workers, to the garbage workers. I think that the struggle for economic rights is extremely important. So this is, I've been to the mountaintop. It was read by him on April 3rd, 1968, the day before he was assassinated. The issue is injustice. The issue is the refusal of Memphis to be fair and honest in its dealings with its public servants, who happen to be sanitation workers. Now, we've got to keep attention on that. That's always the problem with a little violence. You know that what happened the other day, and the press dealt only with the window breaking. I read the articles, They very seldom got around to mentioning the fact that 1,300 sanitation workers are on strike, and that Memphis is not being fair to them, and that Mayor Loeb is in dire need of a doctor. They didn't get around to that. And I just looked up. Mayor Loeb was a white supremacist mayor in Memphis at that time. Now we're going to march again, and we're going to march again in order to put the issue where it is supposed to be and force everybody to see that there are 1,300 of God's children here suffering, sometimes going hungry, going through dark and dreary nights wondering how this thing is going to come out. That's the issue. And we've got to say to the nation, we know how it's going to come out. For when people get caught up with that which is right, and they are willing to sacrifice for it, there is no stopping point short of victory. We aren't going to let any mace stop us. We are masters in our nonviolent movement in disarming police forces. They don't know what to do. I've seen them so often. I remember in Birmingham, Alabama, when we were in that majestic struggle there, we would move out of the 16th Street Baptist Church day after day. By the hundreds we would move out. And Bill Connor would tell them to send the dogs forth. And they did come. But we just went before the dogs singing, ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. Bill Connor next would say, turn the fire hoses on. And as I said to you the other night, Bill Connor didn't know history. He knew a kind of physics that somehow didn't relate to the trans physics that we knew about. And that was the fact that there was a certain kind of fire that no water could put out.
Thank you, Wendy. Next, Nancy Tso from the Friday Peace Vigil.
I'm going to read, it's called Beyond Vietnam. Dr. King gave the speech at the Riverside Church, New York City, on April 4th, 1967. I knew that America would never invest the necessary funds or energies in rehabilitation of its poor, so long as adventures like Vietnam continued to draw men and skills and money like some demonic destructive suction tube. So I was increasingly compelled to see the war as an enemy of the poor and to attack it as such. The war in Vietnam is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. We as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin to shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. Where machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered.
Some heavy stuff here today. All right. Our next person on our program is Dr. Clayborne Carson. He's our guest speaker. He's a sociologist by training. Historian, sorry. The sociologist is next door to my training. He's a historian by training, and I had the honor of meeting him when I was a graduate student at Stanford. And I'm sure there have been many, 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 many graduate students and undergraduates whose lives he has touched with his depth and understanding as a scholar of Dr. Martin Luther King. His wife, Coretta, asked life, his works, and his ethos. Professor Carson.
Can all of you hear me in the back? Yes. Okay, I'll just try. If it wasn't for probably like half of you having coughs in the last 2 months, I could probably speak a lot louder, but I could do that. But in any case, thank you for having me. This has been a wonderful event. This is always the time of the year when I feel like I can get out of my research and talk about it to a public, because 33 years ago, in January of 1985, I got a phone call from Greta Scott King. Unexpected. Actually, my daughter answered the phone earlier in the day, and she was 11 years old, and she was from Mrs. King's office, put the phone down. Later on that night, I get this unexpected call, and then she says, "Oh, Mrs. King called you today." And so I answered that call, and she talked to me about a project that she had in mind. And it was to bring together all of the materials relating to Martin Luther King. She had begun that work at the King Center in Atlanta, and she wanted someone to assemble all of that and publish it as the papers of Martin Luther King. So for the last 30 years, that's what I've been doing. Going through hundreds of thousands of King-related documents, bringing them all, copies of them all to Stanford, and with my staff, publishing all of those books. In fact, if you've seen any book with Martin Luther King on the cover, published in the last 30 years, it comes out of that office at Stanford. Some of you might be aware, for example, of the autobiography of Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King didn't quite write it, but he wrote so much about his own life, his autobiography, that I compiled all that as the autobiography of Martin Luther King. Just like Alex Haley did the same thing with Malcolm X, bringing together all his life story. So what we have tried to do with that is to move away from the notion of seeing King as simply the person who gave the speech at the March on Washington. I was 19 years old. I was at that speech and saw him from a distance. But in the last 30 years, I've been able to see him much closer. I've been able to see. I teach a course online, by the way. If you want to, it's going to be offered again in the spring. It's called The Inner Life and Global Vision of Martin Luther King. And what I try to do is what you've done here today already. Scott's speech, the readings from Martin Luther King. If you want to know about Martin Luther King, let him tell you the story. Don't take it from these accounts that simply reduce him to an orator. Now, what I would like to emphasize, because I was sitting here listening to everything, one of the things about being this far down on the speakers list is that you're saying, "Oh, he's already said that. I can't say that. You've already read that. I can't read that." So what I thought I would do today is to tell you a little bit about Martin Luther King through what I know about Coretta. I think that that's something that we often forget. There were two people going through all these events. When you look back and see those pictures of the people marching from Selma to Montgomery, Martin and Coretta.
Oh, this will save my voice. Thank you. It's not just Martin marching alone. When he went to Chicago in 1966, you see the pictures of him in Chicago. Where was he living? He was living in a ghetto. Who was with him? His wife and his children. When you see him marching on the Voting Rights March, the Meredith March, after James Meredith was shot, marching into Mississippi, who is marching by his side? Coretta. When he is assassinated in Memphis, trying to stage a march and getting the right to have a march of the sanitation workers, the garbage workers. He was not able to do that. But in the aftermath of the assassination, Coretta, a week after her husband is assassinated, she returns to Memphis and leads a sanitation workers strike. And I can tell you, because I worked with her for 20 years before she passed away, there wouldn't be a King holiday today if not for Coretta Scott King. But let me tell you a few things that you might not know about her. When she met Martin in 1952 in Boston, she was beginning her studies at New England Conservatory of Music. She was thinking of a career in music, and she had come to Boston. She was in her first year, and she heard about this guy over at Boston University. People were talking about him, this Baptist minister who was already, even though he was in his first year at Boston University, he was already giving sermons at local churches. And people were saying, this guy got something special. But her response to him, when she heard from a mutual friend, she said, the last thing I would want to do is marry a Baptist minister. And part of it was that she saw herself as somewhat of a radical. She had been a member of the Progressive Party. Some of you know the Third Party in 1948 election. She had, I have a picture of her at the convention having a banner, Wallace for president. Here we go again. She had also been active in civil rights activities. Saved. She had also been active in civil rights activities. She had been involved in peace activities. She was one of the people who helped organize, I think someone mentioned, Women's International Strike for Peace. She was involved in that long before Martin Luther King spoke out against the war in Vietnam. Coretta was speaking out against the war in Vietnam. So when they met, what was interesting, and she told me about this later, she said, here was this minister, he calls me on the phone, says he wants to take me out on a date, and I just kind of put him off, and so we finally got together, and what she found interesting about him was that he had all these radical ideas in his head, but she said he had never done anything. He had never been politically active, he had never been in a protest, he had never even voted. And at that time, when she saw him, she was the activist. He was the one who was still trying to find his way. And one of the things I found out about later, I had heard these rumors that there was a box of documents that she had kept and not made available to any scholar. And I finally got access to those, and if you want to read one of them, you have to go to the papers of Martin Luther King. But in the love letters that Martin sent to Coretta, you see the awakening of his own consciousness. She sends him a book, Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward. Some of you know about Edward Bellamy. He was a 19th century socialist who wrote a book, a science fiction kind of book, about what America would be like in the year 2000 when it became a socialist nation. And they had all this, you imagine readers, that became a bestseller in the 19th century because people were looking, can you imagine a society with free medical care? All these things about, people everybody had employment. There was all of this stuff that he was writing about in the 19th century. So she sends him this book with an inscription. And at a point in their relationship when it looked like it might actually break up, because he was insisting that she come and visit his parents in Atlanta. And she was not sure that she wanted to go that far, because they had only known each other for a few months, and he's already asking her to visit his parents, and she knew that he really needed to find a minister's wife, because a Baptist minister without a wife, especially at that time, was not going to go very far in the field. So she was hesitating, and he got very upset. And then he read the book. So there's this letter, this wonderful letter that he writes to her in July of 1952. And it starts out and said, I'm getting over my anger with you. And he expresses it when you see Martin Luther King with all of his power of words express anger. You don't want to be on the other end of that. And but in the letter he says that, thank you so much for sending me that book. I imagine you know that those ideas are very much in line with my own. And he has this one sentence that I think was, well, the one sentence before the sentence I'll quote, he talks about how happy he'll be when he hears about the nationalization of industry. Now, some of you might know that if that letter had been revealed while he was a leader, it probably would have finished him as a leader. Because there was already these claims that he was a communist, even though he was very much opposed to communism. So that was the reason why she kept these letters secret. But the next sentence says, let us continue to hope, work, and pray to see a warless world, a better distribution of wealth, and a brotherhood that transcends race or color. This is the gospel I will preach to the world. Think about that. This is 1952, a beginning graduate student writing to Coretta Scott and telling and really outlining what his life is going to be. And think about 16 years later, what is he doing? A warless world, taking a stand against the war in Vietnam, a better distribution of wealth, leading a poor people's campaign, and a brotherhood that transcends race or color. And he's talking about a global brotherhood. And I think that leads us, and I want to conclude with this, of looking at his last book. And I think you mentioned it. Where do we go from here, chaos or community? That book was written in 1967, after the passage of civil rights legislation. So he's not talking as a civil rights leader. I think the best way of understanding him, when you look at those early letters and his early writings, is he's a social gospel minister who believes that Christianity has a more radical message than communism. He believed that strongly. In fact, he said that communism is a Christian heresy because Christianity, if it delivered its real message of caring for the least of us, there wouldn't be any communism in the world. You wouldn't need it. So that last book, I think, is the message I'd like to leave with you. And that is, where do we go from here? He was asking that question 50 years ago, and I don't think we've answered it. We have not really addressed where do we go from civil rights progress. I think that the gains that were made during those years are very, very important. For the first time in human history, the majority of humanity gained citizenship rights. Think about that. Before the 1960s, there had never been a point in human history where the majority of human beings were citizens of the place where they happened to live. Most people were either colonial subjects or second-class citizens or under the apartheid system, and they were not full citizens of the place where they happened to live. So that was a wonderful achievement. But what he suggested was that now was the time to move from citizenship rights to human rights. What are the rights that apply to everyone on earth as a result of your birth and not where you were born? We're still dealing with that. That's the issue that underlies so many of our controversies right now about immigration and all of that. It shouldn't matter what passport you have. It shouldn't matter in terms of your human rights. That's what he's trying to get across. So I think that I think this is a wonderful way to celebrate Martin Luther King by coming back to his own words, coming back to his message, and taking the time to study his papers. So I really invite all of you, whenever you're on the Stanford campus, you could find us not in one of those big shiny buildings on the Stanford campus. You go over to the engineering campus, and there are those billion-dollar buildings that they've built there. And across the street, in what for 30 years they called a temporary building there, that's where we are doing our work. And I'm very proud of the work that we're doing. But I do hope that you will spread the word that this important work is going on in Silicon Valley. Because one of the things that we could do, and this is my dream before I retire, is to take all of that information and make it freely, readily available to every person on earth right here. That it is conceivable in the next 10 years that every word that Martin Luther King ever said in a sermon or a speech or in his writings could be right here on your cell phone. I think that that's something that Silicon Valley should take on. And if any of you are close friends with any of those billionaires, let them know that this is something that they should be doing and need to be doing. Thank you very much.
Magat, Newbie Brown, and Christine Pepin, if you are here, please come forward with your readings. Give them a hand as they come forward. Please start.
I'm reading again from the address titled Beyond Vietnam, delivered by Dr. Martin Luther King exactly 1 year before he was assassinated at the Riverside Church in New York City. And this segment reads as follows. The war in Vietnam is but a symptom of a far deeper malady within the American spirit. And if we ignore this sobering reality, we will find ourselves organizing clergy and laymen concerned committees for the next generation. As just a side note, he was addressing the organization called Clergy and Laymen Concerned. They will be concerned about Guatemala and Peru. They will be concerned about Thailand and Cambodia. They will be concerned about Mozambique and South Africa. We will be marching for these and a dozen other names and attending rallies without end, unless there is a significant and profound change in American life and policy. So such thoughts take us beyond Vietnam, but not beyond our calling as sons of the living God. In 1957, a sensitive American official overseas said that it seemed to him that our nation was on the wrong side of a world revolution. During the past 10 years, we have seen emerge a pattern of suppression which has now justified the presence of U.S. military advisors in Venezuela. This need to maintain social stability for our investments accounts for the counter-revolutionary action of American forces in Guatemala. It tells why American helicopters are being used against guerrillas in Cambodia, and why American napalm and Green Beret forces have already been active against rebels in Peru. It is with such activity that the words of the late John F. Kennedy come back to haunt us. 5 years ago, he said, "Those who make peaceful revolution impossible will make violent revolution inevitable." Increasingly, by choice or by accident, this is the role our nation has taken, the role of those who make peaceful revolution impossible by refusing to give up the privileges and the pleasures that come from the immense profits of overseas investments. I am convinced that if we are not to get on to the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered.
I myself want to claim to be a student of King and the practice of loving everyone and having everyone participate together to make a struggle and change in America. I am reading from King in 1967. We as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. I am convinced that if we are to get on the right side of the world revolution, we as a nation must undergo a radical revolution of values. We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profits, motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme militarism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadsides, that we will be only an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho Road must be transformed so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highways. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. A revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth with righteous indignation. It will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concerns for the social betterment of these countries and say, this is not just. It will look at our alliances with the landed gentries of South Africa and say, this is not just. The Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. A true revolution of values will lay hand on the world order and say a war, this way of settling differences, is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of peoples normally humane, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields, physically handicapped and psychologically drained, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplifting is approaching spiritual death. America The richest and most powerful nation in the world can lead with the way in this revolution of values. There is nothing except the tragic death wish to prevent us from reordering our priorities so that the pursuit of peace will take precedence over the pursuit of war. Thank you.
Wow. It is my great honor to read from the speech from March 14th, 1968, titled The Other America. And I use this title because there are literally two Americas. Every city in our country has this kind of dualism, this schizophrenia, split at so many parts. And so every city ends up being two cities rather than one.
All right.
There are two Americas. One America is beautiful for situation. In this America, millions of people have the milk of prosperity and the honey of equality flowing before them. This America is the habitat of millions of people who have food and material necessities for their bodies, culture and education for their minds, freedom and human dignity for their spirits. In this America, children grow up in the sunlight of opportunity. But there is another America. This other America has a daily ugliness about it that transforms the buoyancy of hope into the fatigue of despair. In this other America, thousands and thousands of people, men in particular, walk the streets in search for jobs that do not exist. In this other America, millions of people are forced to live in vermin-filled, distressing housing conditions where they do not have the privilege of having wall-to-wall carpeting, but all too often they end up with wall-to-wall rats and roaches. Almost 40% of the Negro families of America live in substandard housing conditions. In this other America, thousands of young people are deprived of an opportunity to get an adequate education. Every year, thousands finish high school reading at a 7th, 8th, and sometimes 9th grade level. Not because they're dumb, not because they don't have the native intelligence, but because the schools are so inadequate, so overcrowded, so devoid of quality, so segregated, if you will, that the best in these minds can never come out. Probably the most critical problem in the other America is the economic problem. There's so many other people in the other America who can never make ends meet because their incomes are far too low if they have incomes, and their jobs are so devoid of quality. And so in this other America, unemployment is a reality, and underemployment is a reality.
Thank you for all that. I'll be reading an excerpt of a speech for the striking sanitation workers. And in the spirit of Martin Luther King Jr. and his quest for human rights, I'd like us all to remember another segment of America, which is the 2 million plus men and women and juveniles that are languishing, being abused and exploited in our prisons.
Right.
A true revolution of values will soon cause us to question the fairness and justice of many of our past and present policies. On the one hand, we are called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that will only be an initial act. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. And it's okay that we've heard this again. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. With righteous indignation, it will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, South America, only to take those profits out with no concern for the social betterment of the countries and say, this is not just. It will look at our alliance with the landed gentry of South America and say, this is not just. The Western arrogance of feeling that it has everything to teach others and nothing to learn from them is not just. A A true revolution of values will lay hand on the world order and say of war, this way of settling differences is not just. This business of burning human beings with napalm, of filling our nation's homes with orphans and widows, of injecting poisonous drugs of hate into the veins of peoples normally humane, of sending men home from dark and bloody battlefields physically handicapped and psychologically deranged, cannot be reconciled with wisdom, justice, and love. A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death. America, the richest and most powerful nation in the world, can well lead the way in this revolution of values. There is nothing except a tragic death wish to prevent us from reordering our priorities so that the pursuit of peace will take precedence over the pursuit of war. There is nothing keeping us from molding a recalcitrant status quo with bruised hands until we have fashioned it into a brotherhood. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. So I will read an excerpt from a lecture called Nonviolence and Social Change that Dr. King delivered in December 1967 for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. The lecture is part of a book that was released under the title Conscience for Change before King's assassination and republished as The Trumpet of Conscience after his death in 1968. In this speech, King revealed the organizing behind the Poor People's Campaign, which, as you know, was a mass nonviolent civil disobedience campaign planned to shut down the government until it addressed poverty in America. Here we go. The only real revolutionary, people say, is a man who has nothing to lose. There are millions of poor people in this country who have very little or even nothing to lose. If they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life. Beginning in the new year, we will be recruiting 3,000 of the poorest citizens from 10 different urban and rural areas to initiate and lead a sustained, massive direct action movement in Washington. Those who choose to join this initial 3,000, this nonviolent army, this freedom of church of the poor, will work with us for 3 months to develop nonviolent action skills. Then we will move on to Washington, determined to stay there until the legislative and executive branches of the government take serious and adequate action on jobs and income. A delegation of poor people can walk into a high official's office with a careful, collectively prepared list of demands. And if that official says, but Congress would have to approve this, or, but the president would have to be consulted on that, you can say, all right, we'll wait. And you can settle down in his office for as long a stay as necessary. If you are, let's say, from rural Mississippi, and have never had any medical attention, and your children are undernourished and unhealthy, you can take those little children into the Washington hospitals and stay with them there until the medical workers cope with their needs. And in showing it to your children, you will have shown this country a sight that will make it stop in its busy tracks and think hard about what it has done. The many people who will come and join this 3,000 from all groups in the country's life will play a supportive role, deciding to be poor for a time, along with the dispossessed who are asking for their right to jobs or income. Jobs, income, the demolition of slums, and the rebuilding of by the people who live there of new communities in their place. In fact, a new economic deal for the poor.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So doesn't that prove that Dr. King was a non-violent revolutionary? Yes. Okay, so now we have a special talk here. So, you know, for a long time, Dr. King in the United States was compared to Mahatma Gandhi in India, and primarily because they both had doctrines of non-violent struggle. But when we really look at Mahatma Gandhi in perspective, he doesn't even compare with Dr. King, and he was certainly not a revolutionary. But there's another man, Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar, who came up from the lowest ranks of the caste system, the Dalits or untouchables, and launched the struggles for the rights of Dalits in the same way that King led the struggle for rights of the African Americans as well as all of the minorities. And so we're going to have a little talk here by Ilancharan T.S. From the Ambedkar King Study Circle to shed a little bit of light on this.
Hello everyone. I'm Leonard from Ambedkar King Study Circle. First and foremost, I would like to thank San Jose Peace and Justice Center thanks San Jose Peace and Justice Center for this wonderful opportunity. It's a pleasure to be here on the occasion of Dr. King's birth anniversary and to talk about another Dr. King of India, Dr. Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar. He's fondly called Baba Saheb. Many of India's founding fathers had a dream about India. What kind of India they wish to see? Let's take Dr. Ambedkar and Mr. Gandhi. Gandhi's idea of India was that the workers should live at mercy of the trustees and the capitalists. Stability is more important than the social justice. Dr. Ambedkar's vision was that the country has to build on the values of liberty, fraternity, and equality. Mr. Gandhi is popular in West, not only because the Indian elites export Mr. Gandhi and his philosophy, but also because his philosophy serves the interest of West. Dr. Ambedkar dealt this topic of Gandhism in his important work, What the Congress and Gandhi have done to untouchables. In simpler terms, Gandhi was committed to order and stability, and Dr. Ambedkar was devoted to social justice and dignity. I would like to share a little information about our most celebrated and beloved founding father. Dr. Ambedkar was born on 14th April 1891 in an untouchable family who were denied rights to basic necessities like water, land, and education based on their caste. He went on to become the first Indian who earned his doctorate in economics from Columbia University, USA here in 1923. He faced a lot of discrimination in his school days. Even after earning his master's from Columbia University, he went back to India. There also he faced a lot of discrimination. But without getting discouraged, he continued his journey fighting for the social justice. He declared the principle, educate, agitate, and organize, which emphasized the importance of education for the depressed classes and created non-profit organization Depressed Classes Education Society in 1926, which would go on and establish a lot of hostels for those depressed class students and supported their education. Dr. Ambedkar became a formidable force in Indian politics representing the depressed classes during British colonial rule. While continuing his fight to secure social equality, he criticized the caste system of Hinduism, claimed that without destroying the caste system, with its graded embedded inequality, India cannot achieve true democracy. He called for annihilation of caste, and he was the first to say, India is not a nation. It's a nation in the making. Why India is not a nation? He asked how people divided as thousands of castes could be called a nation. Caste is anti-national, which does not allow fraternity to emerge and does not allow sharing. So, a nation can be made only by inclusion of every section and genre of society into governance and decision making by providing equal representation. In his words, democracy is not merely a form of government. It's a primary mode of associated living, of conjoined communicated experience. It is essentially an attitude of respect and reverence towards fellow men. So, in the principle of liberty, equality, and fraternity, Dr. Ambedkar actively campaigned against untouchability and led many movements for the right to access to the public places and resources for the untouchables. One of the biggest movement was Mahat Satyagraha, where he led thousands and thousands of untouchables to a public pond to draw water in Maharashtra, Raigad, Maharashtra. That was in 1927. And he played many major roles in India's institutions, like forming the Reserve Bank of India and reducing the working hours from 12 hours to 8 hours in 1942, where other part of the world were thinking about fair working conditions. So he is a champion of women's rights. Because of him, Indian women were allowed to have right to have property, education, and of mobility. So, before concluding, I would like to quote both Dr. Ambedkar and King. Dr. Ambedkar says, justice has always evoked ideas of equality, of proportion, of compensation. In short, justice is another name of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Dr. King, whose birthday we are commemorating today, reflect the same as social justice and progress are absolute guarantors of rare prevention. There is no other answer. Constructive social change will bring certain tranquility. Evasions will merely encourage turmoil. Whereas Gandhi says, the laborers must be advised scrupulously to abide by the terms of agreement to the landowners. So Gandhi says, in the interest of maintaining the peace and equality. Friends, so I would like to leave it to your judgment whose dreamed land we would like to have, whether land of King and Dr. Ambedkar, where justice prevailed over order, or is it land of Gandhi, where stability is maintained at the cost of liberty and equality. Once again, I thank you for everyone and for this wonderful opportunity.
In closing, I'd like my colleague Sharat to give us our dancers are coming first. Is that right? Oh, yeah, you're ready to go. You want to introduce them?
So now we're going to do a dance a piece. Dance a piece was founded by Ramirez. And I joined her very recently. So the dance a piece is designed to instill peace in everyone. I mean, King was, as you can see, was all for peace. So now we need to make that real by giving you the vibrations of peace and social justice into your blood.